Is the cage door being shut behind UK pension schemes? Hello and welcome to today's Daily Blitz. Now in today's video we'd like to discuss just what's come out of Sajid Javid's department recently regarding mansion taxes and also pension reform.
Yeah, so they're considering two quick reforms to try and raise some money. One is to tax people who own very expensive homes. That would be a wealth tax, which means it's a recurring tax on the value or part of the value of your home, which is an extraordinary thing, especially for a Tory government to do. And the second one is to halve the tax break on pension contributions from 40 down to 20% to try and raise £10 billion. Really, that's what all this is about, to try and find the money for Boris Johnson's spending pledges.
And this would actually, in a way, increase the savings gap that we already have in this country. So, no, we already have enough people who have not managed to save enough for retirement, and this would actually increase that gap already, which seems quite counterintuitive when you contrast that against previous Conservative governments.
Well, their argument would be that it's the wealthy people that's going to hit. But my point is that these people have grown wealthy using a government system of tax incentives. They've treated their home as a savings and retirement savings account, by having the option of selling their expensive home to fund their retirement, and they've used the tax breaks within the pension system to try and raise enough money for their own retirement. And that's being taken away from them after they've put their money inside those assets.
So you see this as a wider phenomenon, effectively, where the government creates these incentives for people to place their wealth into certain assets, which the government can then restrict and corral as they like, right?
That's right. So what I worry about this, and this is a global scale, especially in Australia and here, where the government creates these structures, these tax plans, tax incentives. Homes is another good example. They create the incentive to invest in something by having a tax-efficient way of doing so. But once your assets or your funds are inside these schemes and protected by these rules and regulations that the governments make, then they're subject to rule changes. And what that really does is it's sort of like closing the gate behind someone who's just walked into a trap. You are now subject to whatever the government wants to do. And we've had all around the world governments changing the rules for what happens with funds that are placed inside these protected schemes. Here in the UK, we had Gordon Brown make some rule changes. Now Sajid Javid's considering similar ones. In Australia, we had rule changes for how people could get their money out of those pensions in a tax-efficient way. So I see this as a gradual closing of the gates behind the investors that have put their money into the government incentivized schemes, and I think that makes those schemes risky.
So the dilemma that you're faced with if you ever want to opt out of one of these schemes is, of course, unless you break the law and you don't pay your taxes, you're effectively opting out of really harvesting the wonder that is compound interest. So if, for example, you have a major investment in a company and it pays dividends every year and you pay tax on those dividends, so over time you would accrue a much larger quantity within a tax-efficient vehicle than outside of one. So it's a real dilemma as to whether or not you volunteer to go into the cage or not.
Yeah, and that's the trade-off. So for myself, I'm trying to keep away from these cages as much as possible because I'm quite certain that over time this gate will be closed more and more and more, and by the time I retire, the government will have closed the gate and make it incredibly difficult to try and get my money out of these schemes, whether it's a home or superannuation in Australia or pension schemes here. But each person needs to think about where they are in their life and think about at the rate of the gate closing and whether these sorts of reforms continue, like what's being considered at the Treasury now, whether they are going to have their assets secured or not.
But we should stress that these plans are still only being considered, so it's not certainty that we're going to have this a massive pension reform coming up soon. But it's very important that people take a close look at this stuff when you do see these news stories coming out.
And the most important thing from my point of view is that people see sort of the trend, that this isn't a single change to a pension system or to taxes on property. It's part of a trend, a series of changes that are leading somewhere, and that you become aware of where we're actually going towards.
Yeah, so even if Sajid Javid does not go forward with the pension reforms, it is likely in the future that somebody else will. But that sums up today's Daily Blitz. Thank you very much for watching. Be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell down below, and we'll see you in the next one.